I am excited to hear more and learn more about passing with purpose. So please give a very warm welcome to my English department colleagues, Servais and Angela Romagnoli.
I'm Angela Romagnoli, and we are going to be talking with you some today about this concept of passing with purpose. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Oh, that's all right. The more, the merrier. So some of our goals in our discussion today, or our goal is to engage us in dialogue today to create a working definition of passing.
We also want to apply the concept of passing to our lived experiences and think about how our lived experiences and the theory making that we can make there help us understand what's happening in the book.
We're also hoping to engage in inquiry about passing to arrive at deeper meaning.
We want to engage the politics of the text.
Absolutely. So Lauren and I created a questionnaire that we handed out to students, to be distributed to students. And part of what was scrolling at the beginning was student definitions of what it means to pass. And so another question that we asked students was, is the color line the only border that one may pass across? So these are some of the responses that students came up with. So I'll give you just a second to kind of read through those.
So another question that we got from a few students was just how is this book relevant to contemporary US society? And I think Angela and I were both really amazed by the student responses. And so we actually want to let the student voices respond directly to that question.
And this is probably not even a third of the responses that we got, so they were really, really, really good. Not mine. Somebody has to explain to me what ratchet means. Another talk. Yeah. Another talk.
things we mentioned, or we forgot to mention, was that we wanted to make this as interactive as it could possibly be between 2 presenters and a room full of 100 people. So if at any point you feel like you've got a question, feel free to raise a hand and get in the conversation with us. But one of the things we wanted to do is sort of give you an opportunity to either respond to what you saw here, because clearly there are a lot of instances of passing that are happening, or maybe something else that you just want to put in to our conversation.
Any missing stories from the kind of narratives that we heard about passing that anybody wanted to add? All right, we'll move right along and we'll talk about ourselves for a while then.
So what Angela and I want to do is talk about our lived experiences of passing, talk about the ways that we've engaged in meaning making and theory making around our passing, and then think about how our personal experiences of passing help us understand what's happening in the text. So I want to start by talking about my experience. And so for me, passing has always been a matter of language, or more specifically, discourse. So Lisa Dept, in her quote here, talks about how there's a culture of power. And if you want to participate in the culture of power, then you need to know the codes, the rules for participating in that culture of power. And those codes and rules are the way people interact, the way they dress, the way they talk, and the way they write. And so for me, in the 7th grade, so 12 years old, I made the choice to cross the border that I perceived between Hawaiian Creole and English. So let me talk to you a little bit about Hawaiian Creole. So I'm from Hawaii, and Hawaiian Creole is something that grew out of the plantation system in Hawaii. So Hawaii was colonized, and there's a long history about what happened in Hawaii. One of those things, though, is that there were these huge plantations and not enough laborers. And so in addition to the Hawaiians who would work on the plantations, the plantation owners brought in people from China, Japan, the Philippines, Korea, Portugal, and they're all working in the plantations. What the plantation owners did, though, was they kept people really separated. So if you were from Japan, you lived in the Japan camp. If you were from the Philippines, you lived in the Filipino camp. You were paid different wages, and all of this was a way to keep people at odds with each other, right? Why are those damn people making more money than me, right? And so that was a way to sort of really end any kind of unionizing that might happen. But one of the things that the people did, because they still had to work together, they still had to communicate, so rather than learn English, which was the colonizers' language, and rather than privilege any one of those particular languages of the people, what they did was they created this whole completely brand new language, which is Hawaiian Creole. And so Hawaiian Creole is a mixture of Hawaiian and all the languages that were present. And I think it's pretty damn empowering that people would come together and create this whole language by themselves. But part of what happened is just the way the social structure worked in Hawaii, because we were colonized and because the plantation owners had all the power, right? They have the economic, the social, the political power. What they did was, rather than recognize the fact that Hawaiian Creole is in fact a language, what they did was they took that away completely. And what they did was called it a broken English. And so you can imagine that calling something broken English, right? I mean, broken English is something you say, well, you privilege English, right? That these are people who speak or are not speaking English well. So for me, for my language and my culture, I speak Hawaiian Creole. I consider myself local Hawaiian, and what that means is my ethnicity is local. So I'm from Hawaii, I speak Hawaiian Creole, there are shared values, there's shared culture there. But one of the offshoots then of the plantation system is that Hawaii created these standard English-speaking schools. And these were still public schools. And so what happened is it segregated students. And so if you could pass the test, then you could go to the standard English-speaking school. And it was a way of segregating students, right? So if you were Hawaiian Creole, you went to the poor school, the school where maybe we didn't have all these big expectations for you. And then if you were smart, you could speak English well, then you went to the standard English school. And you can see how this would work for the people in power, right? Because it was a way of controlling who gets access to the good education, who gets access to jobs, and then who gets access, right, to the power. So all of this is happening, and I think my family had no idea what they were doing, because in the 7th grade, they made this decision that they were going to send me to a private Catholic school. And in Hawaii, the remnants of the segregation, so the segregated school system started in the 1920s, it ended 1947, but the remnant still exists in Hawaii in our public and private school system. So a lot of people from the mainland will come to Hawaii, they'll send their kids to private school because they want to keep them away from the Hawaiian Creole English speakers because they're, you know, there's all these stereotypes that exist that you're not that smart because you speak a broken English, right? You don't speak your own language. So what happened for me in the 7th grade is I went from a school that was primarily working class. They all spoke Hawaiian Creole. They were all mixed race, multi-ethnic. And then I moved to St. Anne's, which was in my city, in Kaneohe. And it was predominantly European American. Everyone spoke standard English. And everyone was either upper or upper middle class. And so you can tell already, right? These are two very different populations. And it's hard enough being the odd person out. But early on in the school year, I had this experience where I made the mistake of saying some Hawaiian Creole during recess. My strategy during classes was just don't speak, right? Just if I could just be quiet, let me just get through this day, and I can go home and everything's fine. But I figured it was recess. What's the big deal, right? And so I barely even said a sentence. All I said was the last one. And it's almost like English, right? And so immediately the student responded and said, what you meant to say, Lauren, was that is the student that I have been referring to. Immediately she started laughing at me. And you know, in a 12-year-old's mind, right? You can just imagine you at 12. Me at 12, everything was just the end of the world. Everything was like so dramatic. She started laughing at me, you know, telling the people around her what had happened, the stupid thing that Lauren had just said. She just said this pigeon thing, right? And pigeon is just a Creole, that's the actual thing. So P-I-D-G-I-N. So once it's passed on as a first language, then it becomes a Creole. So what happened for me that night is I went home and I was pretty much devastated. I decided that I wasn't going to tell anybody in my family because I was just so embarrassed. So I kept it for me, I internalized it, but I had this little pity party for myself that night, right? And I'm crying, it's hysterical, right? All these tears. I hate my life, I hate school, I can't believe this. But I had these 2 resolutions that night. The first was that I made this decision that I was never, ever, ever again going to speak Hawaiian Creole at school. I created this divide in myself. I love my language, I love my culture, but that became home. That's the space where I kept it. When I was at school, as long as I was at school, it became English only. And for me, I still had to learn how to speak English well, so for a lot of it was just me not saying anything, me purposely being silent. And the second resolution that I made was I realized early on that this discourse community, not only did they privilege speaking English well, they privileged doing well in school, right? So people who did well in school, it was really valued. So I made this decision, my second one, was that I was going to prove to them that they were wrong. Because what happened for me, this instance with this student, W.B. Du Bois talks about double consciousness. So when he's talking about double consciousness, he's talking about simultaneously being aware of yourself, seeing yourself through your own lens, but simultaneously being able to see yourself through somebody else's lens. So in this moment with this 7th grade student, the whole class laughing at me for speaking Hawaiian Creole, it became clear to me that here in this double consciousness, when I looked at myself through their eyes, I was poor, I was low class, I spoke standard English, and I was just stupid, right? That's how they saw me, and that's how I saw myself through them. So in my second resolution, I decided, you know what? I'm going to prove them that they're wrong about me. I'm going to prove to them that not only am I smart, I'm going to prove to them that I'm smarter than all of them. And I worked. I used to love school. I got to tell you, though, I hated school. I lived like 5 minutes away from school. I'd have my Uncle Ivan take the scenic route, which is like you go around there was this little mountain. We would just go around it. It would add an extra 5 minutes to my drive there. Just because I just didn't want to be there. The whole time, my stomach's in knots, just hating being there. When I wasn't at school, I was at home doing all my homework. It took me all day to get the homework done. Obsessing about school, having all this anxiety. I got to go to school tomorrow, right? So it consumed me. It completely consumed me. But you know, I kept it up. I kept up this dual identity for myself. I did pretty good in school. I stayed in Catholic school, and then fast forward to senior year in high school, and one of the things that I think Angela and I will need to talk about later is part of my issue is going to Catholic school. And so, because I was still at a Catholic school, and this time it was all-girls school, and I read John Donne. And I think John Donne which is interesting for me because he's from England and he's a white dude, but he's responsible for me to be an English major. And he's also responsible for me to really rethink what I've been doing about passing. So I read this, and this is just a part of his meditation. And he says, no man is an island entire of itself. And you know that me being from an island, I was like, he is speaking to me. He is right. Nobody is an island. He's wrong about the continent piece, though. Like, I would change it to say, each is a piece of the island, right? Each of us are a piece of this island. And I got to tell you, I was moved in a way that I just did not expect to be moved. For me, speaking standard English was like barbed wire in my mouth. Like, can you imagine barbed wire in your mouth? It hurt. It was painful. Just get it out. I don't want it in there. And then I read this, and I'm like, wow, that's beautiful. And so for the first time, I had this aesthetic experience, and I saw, wow, there's some beauty in that language. A week later, we read Holy Sonnet 14. And this one, I'm just going to talk to you about the last 2 lines. So what he's saying here, he's playing with paradox. And so he's talking to God, right? Because I'm at a Catholic school, right? So of course we're going to read these religious poems, right? So except you enslave me, I'm never going to be free. So he's playing with paradox, right? Unless you enslave me, God, I'm never going to be free. Nor am I ever going to be chaste, virginal, unclean, undefiled, unless you take me by force and rape me. And I had this moment where I'm like, you know, I'm no scholar on the Bible, and I'm no expert on Christianity, but I'm pretty sure that was sacrilege to say, right? And I'm thinking, you know, I mean, I was at a school where the nuns wore full habits, right? And it's hot in Hawaii, and they're wearing full habits. They would walk around, because we had to wear a uniform, they'd walk around with these yardsticks, with this black marker, and they would check to make sure our skirt was exactly 3 inches, or it could be longer, but it couldn't be any shorter. So these are pretty strict, tough ladies. And we're reading this thing that I'm pretty sure was sacrilege to say, and yet none of them seemed to mind. And so I had this moment where I was like, you know, if John Donne is able to write something with all this passion, and he's able to do it in a way that not even the nuns are going to realize, then maybe there's something to this language that I didn't give it credit for, and that maybe there's this way that I could use language to my own ends, right? That there was a way to subvert it a little bit. And so what John Donne did for me was it helped me realize that, you know, in my passing, what I was doing was I was basically maintaining the status quo. All I wanted was for people to see that I was smart. I totally disagreed with the stereotypes that existed, but what was I doing to fundamentally change those stereotypes? I wasn't doing anything. All I was doing was saying, I need you all to see that I am not like that. And what it did was, you know, this notion that Hawaiian Creole English speakers were not smart, that totally suited the needs of the colonizers. And so me being totally comfortable by creating the split dual identity was me saying, and me being complicit, right, in that colonization, in that oppression. And so he was the one who helped me realize that, you know what, maybe there's this way that I can learn English. And I can learn it in a way that turns the sorting system on its head, that makes available one more voice for fighting against that oppression. And so what John Donne did was he started this new evolution for me about how do I change the way that I'm passing? Because in his poem, he's talking about each person as one part of the larger continent, the island, right? I come from this really strong community. I feel so strong about my Hawaiian Creole English, but as soon as I went to school, turned it off. And for me, it became unacceptable anymore. That if I was going to pass, if I was going to be here, and if I'm going to be here as an English teacher of all things, right? Remember I told you barbed wire in my mouth. And here I am as an English teacher, then it needs to be something more than just for me, right? It needs to be more than just about me being selfish and me being saying, look, I did it. And so one last thing I want us to think about is, I just told you this whole thing about my ethnic identity. And that's the identity that I claim. I claim Hawaiian Creole. I claim being local. And I understand what that means. But one of the issues that I think this book is really good about is this whole notion that even Brian, right, gets to. What is race? So when I crossed the other border of the Pacific Ocean and got here, all of a sudden there's this thing that existed called race. And in Hawaii, I didn't even get that, because nobody asked me. You looked at me, well, I'm mixed race. I'm mixed. I'm Chinese, I'm Filipino, I'm Samoan, I'm Dutch, I'm English, I'm Irish, and I'm German. And I can tell you where all my family members are from, right? And I can tell you their immigration stories, and I'm not unique. I mean, that's pretty much how it is in Hawaii, right? Like, everybody is mixed like that. But then there's this notion of race, and race is completely that. It's a social construction. It's just like Hawaiian Creole and the way that it was defined as being not a language, race is something that people are using and creating to some other end. And so part of what I want us to be thinking about, and part of what I think that is happening in the book, is really us looking at this concept of race. Because one of the questions I'll ask you later is, so what is my race, right? And why do I even have to have a race? Why isn't it enough for me to just say I'm local, I'm from Hawaii, right? But before we get there, I'm going to pass things over to Angela, who's going to talk about the social construction of gender and sexuality.
Absolutely. So we can apply this same theory of social construction to our idea about gender. But actually, before I go on, let's get on the same page about a couple of terms. What is the difference between your gender and your sex? What is your sex? What's your sex?
Identifying by like body parts?
Yeah, your sex is your body parts, right? Your sex is your genitalia, essentially. So then what is your gender?
Identifying the characteristics of either females or males.
So Judith Butler, who's one of the theorists in the back of the Passing book, describes your gender as a performance. That your gender is the way that you perform, maybe the way that you see your sex, right? So if we perform gender, where do we get the rules about what is appropriate? Where do we learn how to behave like an appropriate man or woman, or to be a man or a woman? Where do we learn those rules? Culture, like what?
Your parents.
Our parents.
What they do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Our parents. Who else influences our idea about what it means to be a man or be a woman?
Media.
The media, absolutely. Any others?
Friends.
Friends.
Toys.
Toys, absolutely, right? You got to shop in the pink aisle or the blue aisle. Any others?
Church.
Church, absolutely, absolutely, right? So that is to say then, do we agree that gender is something that is created socially? That it is not your biology, it is a set of rules that we learn from our engagement with society. True story, yes? Okay, so that's exactly what I want to talk with you a little bit about today, is the power that language has to shape, construct, and change reality. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the ways that we use language, but also the ways in which we are kind of used and abused by language. And similar to Lauren, my story starts in Catholic school. But before we go to my personal story, I thought one of my favorite identity theorists, her name is Dale Spender, and she wrote a piece called The Politics of Naming. She says in The Politics of Naming, well, actually, by naming, she means the actual words that we give to things, right? For abstract things like love and hate, I can't show you love in my hand in order to tell you what it is, right? I have to name it. I have to give you words so that you can imagine what love is, what it feels like to be in love. So that's all she means by naming, which doesn't sound highly political, right? But that's the argument that she's making. She says by assigning names, we impose a pattern and a meaning which allows us to manipulate the world. So what she's commenting on here is on the power of the storyteller, right? She's commenting on how the winners in history usually get to tell the stories, right? Which, I don't know about you, but this is that Thanksgiving story that I was given in my Catholic school, right? But the story from another angle might be a little different, right? If the Native Americans were telling the story of American history, the story that we were taught in K-12 might look a little different. So these ideas of passing and naming are inextricably linked in my life, because essentially you use language to do or to not do both of them, right? So now I'll give you a little context for what we're going to talk about. I grew up in the 80s. which is like the gay dark ages, right? No Ellen. This is before Will and Grace, all that good stuff. So until 3rd or 4th grade, I had no concept for what it meant to be gay, right? I didn't know the word gay. There was no homosexual. I had no gay people in my family, at least not that we were talking about over dinner. I didn't have a framework for gay in reality. It would be like saying Facebook right now. It would be like saying Facebook to somebody in like 1920, right? It just wasn't part of my reality. But I did always have this sneaking suspicion that all of the adults and other people in my life knew some secret about me that I didn't know. I give you Exhibit A. Right? Oh, you're like ruining the effect. Just be like, man, what a lesbian, right? I mean, so I think this is like 4th grade, which was like right around the time when I had my first experience at this intersection between passing and naming. So I was in Catholic school, and like all good Catholic school children, the boys were in the pew in front of the girls. And 2 of the little boys in front of me started talking, and I heard one of them ask the other, "Are you going to take Angela to the Valentine's Day dance?" And I was like freaking out, right? I like leaned forward, all excited to hear what he's going to say. And he goes, "Fuck no, that's disgusting. She's a dyke." And in that moment, cute little Moises, right, said that. But in that moment, I knew that he was right. I didn't know what the hell he meant, but I knew that what he was saying was right about me. And then I also assumed then that the disgusting part was right too. So, and I also knew that I couldn't take it home. I knew that I couldn't go home and say, "Man, Mom, I was called a dyke today." Not because my parents ever told me that it was bad to be gay or that they hated gay people or that I was going to hell, but because they never said anything, right? The silence in my house was assimilative, right? So that essentially reinforced the idea that being gay was disgusting, that it should be something that I hide. So to come back to the Spender piece, to politics of naming, she also says that we are dependent on names, but we are mistaken if we do not appreciate that they are imperfect and often misleading. When one group holds a monopoly on naming, its bias is embedded in the names it supplies. And that's the piece that I was missing in 4th grade, right? I wasn't ready to start conceptualizing bias and identity politics. I was obsessed with a huge basketball, obviously, in 4th grade. So that's kind of why I allowed myself to dislike myself for too many years about being gay. That moment changed my life. And it made me feel like I was hiding a dirty little secret. So I spent much of my life working really, really hard to pass. And so there's Exhibit B. I looked like this from the time that I am in high school until like my mid-20s. So, and that time is essentially comprised of a series of unfortunate events, which include a bachelor's from a Baptist university and a stint at coaching college basketball. So although it appears in this picture like I am passing successfully and happily, obviously I was not, right? I was miserable, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. And I don't know, I look straight enough, but I had 2 really big dead gay giveaways, right? Number 1, I played basketball. And if any of the women here are athletes, you can probably identify with, whether you're gay or not, people will assume if you're an athlete, you might be a lesbian, right? So I had that kind of working against me, and I always had really cool girlfriends, which means I always wanted to spend all my time with just one girl. So I was kind of working against myself, and I had these little giveaways which other people picked up on, and passing was never something that I was able to do without work. So at California Baptist University, this is where I did the most work to pass. This is their student handbook, which is what you sign when you become a student. So I signed the handbook where it says, students should respect the religious traditions, values, and ethics of the university, but you do not have to be a practicing Christian. So that was, and many Christian colleges do require that you are a practicing Christian in order to attend the college. So I signed for my scholarship, happy, end of day. But then I read a little later into the university's statement of faith, which is titled The Christian and the Social Order, which further details the university's values. And it says, in the spirit of Christ, Christians should oppose racism, every form of greed, selfishness, and vice, and all forms of sexual immorality, including adultery, homosexuality, and pornography. So at the institution that was paying my tuition for me to represent them in the gym, thought of me as pornography, essentially. And how they mediated that, or how they made sure that nobody was gay, is they had a 3 strikes rule while I was there. And on the first strike, so on the first rumor that you're gay, which you can, I'm sure, imagine, on the first rumor that you're gay or the first drunken photo of you with your arm around another person of your same sex, that was the first strike, and you were given a punishment on campus. So that could be counseling, that could be some kind of community service, but you were allowed to stay in your classes. Second strike, you're suspended, and you have to get outside help and petition to be reinstated to the university. Third strike, you're out of the college forever. And they're actually, California Baptist is being sued right now by a transgender student who they are saying lied on her application. So that's, I don't know, an interesting way to look at passing, I suppose. So I'll spare you the bloody details of the rest of my self-loathing and pain and New Testament, which all thankfully came together and led me to my love, or one of my loves, which is queer theory. So before I talk to you a little bit about what queer theory is, what does it mean to be queer? Different, right? Not just gay, right? That is kind of the assumption when you tell people, oh, I'm reading a book on queer theory. They're like, oh, you're studying gay people? That is not, I mean, that is part of what queer theory does. But essentially what queer theory is interested in is our ideas of normal and abnormal, or acceptable and unacceptable. So queer theory moves beyond gay and lesbian theory and feminist studies and kind of extends the conversation to include any type of identity that includes sexual identities, particularly those that form or that fall under normative and deviant categories. The reason that sex is so tied up in this idea of queer is because it's tied up in our everyday lives all over the place, right? I mean, the language around sex or sexuality is so deeply embedded in our social institutions, like our families and our churches and our politics, and it's also embedded in our personal narratives, right? I mean, we have movies like The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and we tell about our first time and our last time and our best time, or that we never get any. We tell all kinds of stories about, we watch television shows about sex all the time. It's all over our culture. So the queer struggle aims not just at tolerance or equal status for LGBT people, but at challenging those institutions that kind of reinforce discrimination. So if we are going to apply a queer lens to the gay marriage fight, like you would think, oh, queer theorists should support gay marriage. That seems like a logical connection, but that's not actually the case. A queer approach to the fight of gay marriage actually positions gay marriage as assimilation into heteronormative culture, which is why my wife and I are constantly asked the question, who's the man in your relationship? How do you decide who takes out the trash, right? So a queer approach to the gay marriage fight would be to dismantle marriage or send marriage back into the personal realm, send it back to churches, back to individuals, and take it away as a state or federal basis for limiting certain groups' rights to access to things like healthcare, citizenship, housing, tax benefits, and in my life, happiness, arguably. So the queer agenda extends beyond a gay rights agenda to a human rights agenda, is what queer theory seeks to do. So it holds essentially that identities are not fixed, right? That they cannot be simply categorized and checked off in boxes because they consist of many varied components. And to categorize humans by a single characteristic is too simplistic and plain wrong. So I'll close with telling you about how queer theory saved my life. Queer theory essentially gave me an arsenal of language to use to tell everybody else in my life to F off. Kind of. But it also, what it really did was it gave me the power to name myself, right? It gave me this, I don't know, an arsenal of language tools to use to establish what in my life it meant to be a dyke, which now I rock a little differently now that I own it than when it's like thrown at me, right? So this term, genderfuck, is one of my favorites because I think it really embodies what queer theory seeks to do, which is that whole, like, what is normal, what is acceptable, what is deviant, right? Even saying fuck in an academic setting or a social setting, that plays with those binaries of what is acceptable, what is acceptable academic discourse, which comes right back to what queer theory is seeking to do. Even with the phrase queer theory, with queer being embedded so deeply in our academic discourse that you can get advanced degrees doing it, it has, I don't know, it's changed academics. It has changed what is acceptable terrain for academics. And because I got that language, too many of my friends still live in that place where being gay means being disgusting. And a lot of my friends took their own lives fully believing their God would send them to hell, but preferring that to living in their own personal hell. So I really do credit queer theory, and I came to queer theory through English, which is my primary love. So I credit it very much with saving my life, or changing my life. I don't know about saving, but changing my life for sure, much like I think happened in Lauren's case. So this is, I think, where Lauren's going to chime back in with me, and we're going to talk a little bit how we can apply these ideas of queer theory to Nella Larsen and to the text passing.
And part of what we want us to think about, and we want to open it up too to see if maybe you've got comments or things that you want to say in response to this question. Because if we look at queer theory as this notion of dismantling, right, that these binaries that exist, the things that maybe we consider normal, I want us to think about how maybe passing is doing some of that in terms of race, and maybe even with sexuality.
I just skipped this little piece, like kind of like a way to apply this. Here, I have a little list of the things that queer theory asks us to do. First of all, it asks us to be playful, even at work or school. It demands that we question everything, including and especially authority, and that we talk about taboo things. And it also demands that we inquire about these binaries like normal and deviant that generally serve to categorize, dehumanize, hierarchize, and oppress individuals. So if we think about Nella Larsen, what binaries, we can think of what types of binaries was she working to shatter, or was she working to challenge?
We want to give you a chance to jump in there before.
I mean, what risks is she taking at that time as an author? What ideas, I think Lauren talked a little bit about a primary idea that she's challenging.
Well, there's race and social class.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. She challenges our ideas about race and social class, absolutely. Any others? Did the book at all feel sexual to you? Like it is possibly alluding to a sexual, yeah, is that a hand? Yes? Yeah?
I felt that that she was interested in Claire.
So you think there could possibly be a romantic relationship between Claire and Irene?
Absolutely. Maybe she didn't recognize that she may have been repressing it and then pushing it off on her husband and other people.
But it's never explicitly stated, right?
It's not.
Why? Why would Nella Larsen create the possibility but never let it come full circle? Absolutely, I think that's a great reason.
Probably would have been totally back then.
Indeed, absolutely. Like, definitely a lesbian fic novel is not getting published at this time, right? It was already a cutting edge type text. Any others? Sure, maybe, perhaps, absolutely. I mean, she took the race battle face on. So yeah, maybe, absolutely, for sure.
Well, she even changed the name.
Absolutely. Does anybody remember what the initial name of the book was? Nig. Why would it have been Nig? Why do you think she first would have named it Nig?
And how that changes the whole way we come to the text, right?
That was Claire's nickname.
Right, but what does it mean to call it after Claire when so much of the book is privileged from Irene's perspective, right? Usually a book is named after the heroine, right? And so what argument possibly could she be making there? And how does that challenge our own notions as readers about who we're supposed to side with, given we're in Irene's head? We're not in Claire's head, right? Do you want us to address this?
Well, it's funny because we also asked students if they had any questions about the text. And that was actually that was a very common question that people asked. Are there other reasons? I mean, I think, how else might we talk about this?
I have another question about, my English teacher said yesterday that there was actually one paragraph was somehow lost in transportation or transfer from the book to the publisher, so that we're actually missing a final paragraph. And what more do we know about that? What was in that? I mean, to me, I think the reason why it was switched, we asked that specific question, was because I think that would have leaned towards more of the idea that she had a fixation on her.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Nella Larsen, I think she likes to play. I think she's like messing with us. I mean, she's messing with our ideas of race, she's messing with our ideas of class, and I think she's messing with our ideas about sexuality. And I think that was just too messing with. That was like too much play, I think, maybe out front.
Right, and I think too that it would have, you're not supposed to pass. And to say that the hero of the book is passing, I think that would have been way too political for her to make of a statement. Because I think she really is challenging these notions of race, right? You have these people who are both. Why can't they be both? Why do they have to be either or? And if you have these people who just won't fit into these categories, because we need the categories, right? We need nice. It's not, I can't tell people I'm all those things. I have to say, well, I'm Asian and Pacific Islander, right? But am I not white too? Right? But nobody would say that. So, I mean, part of what she's doing is really, I mean, she's challenging that.
She also brings in the patron of the arts, who in that notion, they almost become it's like you're wondering, does he really care, or is this a freak sideshow for him?
Yeah.
You know, because of his curiosity and the ignorance, like thinking things that aren't true, that, you know, like not being well informed enough, and then bringing it back to other people who he wants to pull into that.
Right.
So you wonder what gain is he looking for? It never really states it exactly.
And I think she would argue that the whole thing is a sideshow, right? And that's why she was going to name it after Claire, after Nig, right? Because the whole thing is just ridiculous.
What, next one? So we started here a little bit. We kind of started venturing down this road. Anybody want to throw out an opinion? I mean, it is up to speculation whether or not there is some sexual attraction taking place between Irene and Claire in the book. Did any of you feel that you found?
I'm going to comment that, you know, intimacy can exist in heterosexual relationships and friendships just as much as ones that have that sexual attraction. So, you know, maybe the intimacy that exists in their friendship is a little blurred.
Well, and that brings about this question to get all queer on it, is like, what is normal? What are the normal parameters for friendships between women, right? And who gets to make those rules? And as a gay person who's friends with not only gay women, but straight women, those rules don't exist. And sometimes it is awkward terrain to navigate.
And I think Angela and I disagree a little bit on how we define this one. And the way I look at it is, I think what happens with Irene is she completely buys into the stereotype and the privileging of class. So when we look at Claire, Claire can pass for that white beauty. And so I think that her constantly looking at Claire as this beacon of beauty is also then Irene going through that self-denigration. That every time she's in Claire's presence, she feels dowdy. Right? She's got this nice brand new dress, but she still feels like a lump, right? Because she's not that. She's not that European ideal that we have of what beauty is supposed to be. And so I think that when we see her doing that, we actually see her internalizing that stereotype. And I think it's self-hatred.
We've got just like a couple minutes left. Should we open up, if you all have questions for us or about the text that you want to throw out, we can address those questions, or we can wrap it up, I guess. No questions, comments, concerns?
Irene relationships is almost kind of like a Mean Girls, where there's a friend that you're just fascinated with, but you kind of like love to hate them because they're different than you, but you almost want to be with them. It's kind of that.
Absolutely, she plays on that kind of tension.
But it's hard, because which one's the mean girl? Right? And when you get to part 3 and you see what happens, I mean, it's hard.
It does get intense. And the question that we did not answer was, how did Claire die? Oh. Let's do a quick poll. How many of you think that Claire committed suicide? Oh. How many of you think she was pushed? Oh, man. Well, Lauren has a really interesting perspective, so you should ask her, but I think we should probably wrap it up.
We're gonna, yeah.
All right, well,
thank you all.
Thank you.